The knife scraped against the plate, the sound sharp, cutting through the quiet laughter in the dining room. The room was warm, filled with the rich scent of roasted meat and wine, but the air felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just charged like a silent undercurrent running beneath the surface. My husband sat at the head of the table, his attention split between his plate and his phone, completely at ease, completely unaware. Across from me, his nephew sat with one arm slung lazily over the back of his chair, his body relaxed, his gaze anything but. His eyes lingered too long, his smirk held an edge of amusement as if he knew something I didn't. "You always this quiet at dinner?" he asked, his voice smooth, just loud enough for me to hear over the soft clatter of silverware. My husband barely reacted, busy scrolling through emails. I didn't look up right away, taking an extra second to steady myself before answering. "Just tired," I murmured, pushing a piece of roasted potato around my plate. "Long day," he pressed, tilting his glass slightly, watching me over the rim. The casual way he spoke made it clear, he wasn't just making small talk. "Always," I replied, keeping my tone light, indifferent, but something in his expression shifted slightly, like he was testing the weight of my words. The conversation continued, my husband talking about work, the traffic, some article he read earlier, and I nodded in all the right places, but my mind wasn't there. I was too aware of the way the man across from me moved, effortless, confident, the way he leaned in slightly whenever I spoke, like he was actually listening, like he actually noticed. It had been years since someone noticed. The realization struck me harder than it should have. My husband laughed at something on his phone, shaking his head as he scrolled. "You should see this," he said, turning the screen toward me, but I barely glanced at it. Instead, I forced myself to focus on my plate, my fork, anything but the steady gaze still locked onto me. Dinner stretched on, slow, deliberate. He was careful, never obvious, never anything that could be called out, but it was there. The way his fingers tapped idly against his glass when I spoke, the flicker of amusement when I tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear, the way his smirk deepened when I finally looked up and caught him staring. It wasn't bold, wasn't intrusive. It was just enough. Enough to make my pulse quicken. Enough to make my hands feel too warm. Enough for something in my stomach to tighten in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. By the time I stood to clear the plates, I needed space. My husband didn't even glance up, already lost in whatever was on his screen. I turned toward the kitchen, letting the familiar routine ground me. The sound of running water, the clink of dishes, the weight of the evening settling over my shoulders. And then I heard it. Soft footsteps behind me, deliberate, unhurried. I didn't turn. I didn't have to. He reached past me, grabbing a glass from the shelf, his arm brushing mine. Just barely, just enough. "Thanks for dinner," he murmured, voice low, close. I nodded, but the movement felt stiff. "Glad you liked it." My hands kept moving, rinsing, drying, anything to keep me anchored. But he didn't leave. He didn't step back. He stayed there, just close enough that I could feel the warmth of him at my side. And then it happened. His fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't necessary. It wasn't long. But it lasted just enough to change something. Neither of us moved at first. Second, maybe too long. Then he pulled away, slow, controlled, lifting his glass to his lips. "Good night," he said, his voice unreadable. I swallowed, turning away before he could see the way my hands shook slightly. "Good night," I echoed. But as I walked down the hall, I could still feel the ghost of his touch lingering on my skin. He was getting bolder. I noticed it in the way he moved, how effortlessly he took up space, how he positioned himself just close enough for it to feel intentional but never close enough for anyone else to notice. It wasn't obvious, not to my husband, not to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But I was. And I saw everything. The way he leaned against the counter in the morning, arms crossed, watching me pour coffee like I was the most interesting thing in the room. The way his gaze traveled when I reached up to grab a plate from the shelf, lingering a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The way he smirked whenever I fumbled with my words around him, like he knew something I didn't, like he was enjoying the effect he had on me. It was subtle, maddeningly subtle, but I felt it everywhere. At dinner, my husband sat between us, completely unaware, talking about his day, about work, about something that happened on the news. I nodded, pretended to listen, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Across the table he met my gaze, steady, unwavering. I looked away too quickly. I was making it worse, I knew that, but it was impossible to ignore. He saw everything. He saw the way I tucked my hair behind my ear, The way I bit my lip when I was deep in thought, the way I shifted in my seat when the air between us got too heavy. And he enjoyed it. Later that evening, after my husband had gone to bed, I stayed in the kitchen rinsing dishes, trying to clear my mind. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that made everything feel sharper, more noticeable. I should have gone upstairs. I should have put space between us. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I didn't turn around, but I knew it was him. I felt him before I saw him, that presence, that weight in the air. He moved behind me, close, too close, his voice quiet but unmistakably amused. "You nervous?" The words sent a shiver down my spine. I inhaled sharply, focusing on the dish in my hand, the water running over my fingers. Why would I be? My voice was steady, but my body betrayed me. I was too aware, too tense. I heard the shift in his breathing just behind me, so close I could almost feel it against my skin. "I don't know. You tell me." It was a challenge, a game, a test I wasn't prepared to take. I turned too quickly, my shoulder brushing against his arm, my breath hitching before I could stop it. His expression didn't change, but there was something there, something unreadable, something dangerous. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the sink. "You should go to bed," I said, keeping my voice even. He didn't move right away. His eyes held mine, a flicker of something almost amused before he finally took a step back. "Good night," he said, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just set my pulse racing, like he hadn't just twisted something inside me I wasn't ready to name. I didn't answer. I turned back to the sink, gripping the counter, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hall. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my husband sleeping soundly beside me. I closed my eyes, willed my mind to quiet, but it didn't. His voice echoed in my head, soft, teasing. "You nervous?" The way he stood behind me, close enough to make me forget how to breathe. The way he watched me like he was waiting. I shifted under the covers, trying to shake the feeling, trying to bury it, trying to pretend like it wasn't real. But it was. And it wasn't going away. The front door shut with a dull click, and I stood frozen for a second, listening to the faint hum of my husband's car engine fading into the distance. The house was quiet, too quiet. It was the first time in days we were completely alone, just the two of us, no distractions, no buffers, no excuses. I took a breath, forced my body to move, to act normal, to ignore the slow burn of anticipation curling in my stomach. I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't. But as I stepped into the kitchen, I felt it again. That presence, that awareness, like gravity itself, had shifted the moment my husband left. He was already there, leaning casually against the counter, watching me with that same unreadable expression. The air felt thick, charged, but I kept my movements deliberate, controlled. I grabbed a glass of water, ignoring the way my fingers felt unsteady against the cool surface. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there like he was waiting for something. When he finally spoke, his voice was too smooth, too knowing. "Just us today, huh?" I nodded, kept my gaze on the water in my hands. "Looks like it." A slow smirk tugged at his lips, like he could hear the restraint in my voice. "You nervous?" The same words from the night before, the same challenge laced in his tone, but this time there was no one else in the house. No safety net. No reason to pretend I didn't understand exactly what he meant. I exhaled slowly, set the glass down, turned away, but I felt his eyes on me like a weight pressing against my skin. Every movement felt magnified. The way I reached for the cabinet, the way I tucked my hair behind my ear, the way my breath hitched when I heard him step closer. I told myself I was imagining it, that he wasn't really doing anything, that this was all in my head. But then I turned back and he was there, closer than before, not enough to touch, but enough that I had to tilt my chin up to meet his gaze. His eyes flickered to my lips and my stomach flipped so hard I gripped the counter just to stay grounded. "Should I step back?" His voice was quiet now, lower, and for a split second I thought he actually meant it, thought he was giving me an out. But there was something else in his eyes, something that said he already knew the answer. I swallowed, forced myself to think, forced myself to remember that this was wrong, that I should walk away. But I didn't move. And neither did he. The moment stretched, thick and heavy, until he finally leaned in. It was slow, deliberate, like he was testing the air between us, giving me a chance to stop him. I could have. But I didn't. Our lips met, light as a whisper, barely a breath between us, just enough to feel the warmth, the heat, the sharp intake of air that neither of us released. It wasn't a kiss, not really, Just the suggestion of one, just enough to make my entire body tighten like a coil wound too tight. And then it was over. I jerked back, breath coming too fast, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs like a warning bell. He didn't move, didn't react, just stood there watching me, waiting. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, anything, but nothing came out. His head tilted slightly, eyes dark, considering. Guess that answers my question. I turned, walked out of the kitchen without looking back, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing the way my hands trembled at my sides. It was a mistake. It had to be. But if it was a mistake, why did I already know I was going to let it happen again? I tried to avoid him. I moved through the house with careful precision, calculated my steps, timed my exits and entrances so that we wouldn't cross paths. But it didn't matter. The space between us only grew heavier, thick with something unspoken, something I was too afraid to name. Every time I walked into a room, I felt it. His presence, his gaze, the way his body stilled for half a second before he forced himself to act like nothing had changed. But everything had. And we both knew it. At dinner, I kept my eyes down, focused on my plate, on the sound of my husband's voice as he told some story from work. But I wasn't listening. My thoughts were tangled, my body still remembering the heat of that moment in the kitchen, the feel of his lips barely brushing mine. I stole a glance across the table just for a second, just to see if I was imagining things, but the moment I looked up, I regretted it. He was watching me, calm, composed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they were full of something else. Something dangerous. Something that said he hadn't forgotten. I forced myself to focus, forced myself to smile at the right moments, to nod, to pretend like everything was normal. But it wasn't. It hadn't been since that kiss. Later that night, my husband wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, his breath warm against my neck. It was familiar, safe, but I felt nothing. My body was stiff, my skin too aware of every movement, every touch that didn't feel the way it used to. I closed my eyes, tried to sink into the moment, tried to remind myself that this was my life, that this was where I belonged. But all I could think about was the way I had pulled away too fast, the way my breath had caught in my throat for all the wrong reasons. I turned onto my side, mumbling something about being tired, and he didn't question it. He just kissed my shoulder, whispered goodnight, and rolled over, drifting into sleep like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. The house was quiet when I finally stepped out of the bedroom, needing air, needing space, needing something I couldn't explain. I told myself I was just going to the kitchen, that I just needed water, but the second I reached the hallway, I knew I wasn't alone. He was there, leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed, his head tilted slightly like he had been expecting me. I stopped. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, wrapping around us like a noose. I should have turned around, should have gone back to bed, should have pretended like I didn't see him. But I didn't move. "You don't have to be afraid of this," he said, his voice quiet, measured. I swallowed hard, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter behind me. "I don't know what you're talking about." His lips curved slightly, like he had already seen through every one of my lies. "You want this just as much as I do." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head before I even processed what he had said. "You're wrong." He took a slow step forward, not touching me, not closing the distance completely, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Am I?" My breath caught, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to argue, wanted to push him away, wanted to say something that would make this stop. But the words never came. Because he was right. And we both knew it. I told myself it had to stop, that I had let it go too far, that I was losing control of something I had no right to entertain. I forced myself to wake up early, made coffee before my husband even got out of bed, greeted him with a warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. I asked him about work, about the project he had been talking about for months, smiled when he kissed my cheek, laughed at something that wasn't really funny just to convince myself that this was where I belonged. I clung to the routine, to the safety of the life we had built, but no matter how much I tried, I felt like an actress reciting lines that no longer fit the script. At breakfast, I leaned over and kissed my husband first, unprompted, unexpected, a test for myself more than anything else. His lips were familiar, the taste of coffee and something sweet lingering on his breath, but as soon as it happened, I knew. There was no rush of heat, no spike in my pulse, no fire in my veins like there had been before. It was soft, simple, safe. I pulled back, forced a smile, pretended like everything was fine. He smiled too, oblivious, satisfied. But across the room I felt it. A shift in the air, a quiet disturbance that sent a shiver up my spine. I turned my head slightly, barely enough to acknowledge it, but I saw him. He was watching. Not glaring, not reacting, just observing, his eyes unreadable, his expression infuriatingly calm. He had seen the kiss, had witnessed the performance, and I expected something. Anger, amusement, jealousy, but all I got was that smirk. A knowing, patient curve of his lips that sent my heart tumbling straight into my stomach. The tension didn't fade. If anything, it grew worse. I felt him everywhere, in the silent glances across the dinner table, in the moments when we passed each other in the hallway, in the way my skin prickled every time he walked into the room. He didn't push, didn't say anything, didn't need to. He knew exactly what was happening. One night as I set the table, my husband walked in, ruffling his hair, distracted by something on his phone. I barely noticed, too focused on steadying my breathing, too aware of the other presence moving around the kitchen with practiced ease. He reached for a plate, standing close enough that our arms brushed. A second, maybe two, but it was deliberate, slow, intentional. My heart stopped. It was nothing. A meaningless touch. But it wasn't meaningless, and we both knew it. I jerked away, my fingers tightening around the plate, my entire body locking up, but he didn't even blink. He just grabbed what he needed and moved past me as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just lit another match to the fire already burning inside me. My husband didn't notice. He was still scrolling through his phone, talking about something at work, completely unaware of the way my world had just shifted again. I sat at the table that night, nodding at the right moments, forcing myself to eat, to speak, to exist in this space like I was supposed to. But inside I was unraveling. I wanted this to stop, needed it to stop, but the truth clawed at the edges of my mind, relentless, undeniable. I could kiss my husband 1,000 times, I could force myself to go through the motions, but it would never feel the same. The damage was already done. I told myself I could control it, that if I just ignored it long enough, it would fade, that it was a passing moment of weakness, a mistake, nothing more. But it wasn't fading. It was growing, feeding off every glance, every second of silence stretched too long, every moment when I caught myself waiting, listening for his footsteps, anticipating his presence before he even walked into the room. It was no longer something I feared. It was something I craved. I found myself lingering in places where I knew he would pass, slowing down in hallways, reaching for things in the kitchen just as he entered, feeling that familiar pull in my stomach every time he was near. It wasn't subtle anymore. It wasn't an accident. And worst of all, I knew he could see it too. One evening, after my husband had gone upstairs early, I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to clean, my hands moving mindlessly over the counter, my breath coming too shallow as I felt it. That shift in the air, that unmistakable awareness that told me I wasn't alone. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I felt him there, standing in the doorway, watching me, waiting. The seconds dragged, slow and heavy, until finally I forced myself to move, reaching for a glass, anything to break the silence. But as soon as I did, I felt it. His presence right behind me, close enough that my skin tingled, close enough that I had to grip the counter to keep myself steady. I turned, intending to walk past him, to put space between us, to prove that I still had control. But the moment our eyes met, I knew I had already lost. He didn't say anything, didn't smirk, didn't tease. He just stood there, watching, his expression unreadable, his gaze locked onto mine like he was daring me to look away first. I took a step back. He took one forward. My breath caught, my pulse hammering, every nerve in my body screaming for me to do something. Anything, but I couldn't move. And then, like it had happened 100 times before, his hand brushed against mine. It was nothing, just a fleeting touch, a meaningless accident. But it wasn't. Because this time neither of us pulled away. I swallowed hard, my fingers twitching, my entire body locked in place as the silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I should have walked away. I should have said something to break the moment. But I didn't. Because I didn't want to. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes searching mine, and for the first time I saw it. He wasn't questioning this anymore. He wasn't hesitant, wasn't testing the waters. He knew exactly what was happening. And he knew that I wasn't stopping it. The realization hit me like a shock to the system, sharp and undeniable. There was no turning back. I had already crossed the line, and I didn't want to go back. I had been careful, meticulous, convinced that I could keep everything under control, but something had shifted. I was slipping. It started with small things. Pauses too long when he entered the room, glances that lingered when they shouldn't, a hesitation in my voice when my husband asked me something while my mind was still elsewhere. I felt it before I saw it, the way his eyes narrowed slightly at dinner when I reacted half a second too late, the way he glanced between me and his nephew with something unreadable but sharp, something that made my stomach twist. He was noticing. He didn't say anything, but I felt the weight of his awareness like a shadow following me from room to room. It wasn't just him. Sarah had always been good at reading between the lines, and I should have known she'd pick up on it. It was in the way she tilted her head slightly when we sat together over coffee, the way she studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You seem distracted lately," she said, her voice light, casual, but her eyes too focused. I laughed it off, brushing her concern aside with some excuse about work, about stress, but I saw the flicker of doubt in her face. And then at dinner she saw it. I hadn't noticed when he walked in, hadn't realized how obvious it was until it was too late. My gaze had lifted before I could stop it, drawn to him like gravity itself had shifted in the room. He met my eyes, unreadable but steady, and I looked away too quickly, too forcefully. Sarah saw it. She didn't react immediately, didn't call me out, but when I glanced at her from across the table, her lips were pressed together, her expression unreadable. He knew. That night I tried to act normal, tried to stay in the safe routines of before, but the walls felt like they were closing in. I couldn't focus, couldn't pretend that everything was the same when I felt the weight of too many eyes on me. My husband, suspicious but silent. Sarah watching but saying nothing. And him. Always him. Later, when the house was quiet and I was standing alone in the hallway, I heard his voice, low and steady, right behind me. "Come to my place." The words sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric, like a live wire pressing against my skin. I turned, pulse hammering, but he didn't move, didn't waver. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made it impossible to breathe. I knew what he was asking. I knew what it meant. I should have said no. I should have walked away. Instead I nodded. Okay. I shouldn't have come. I knew it the second I stepped inside, the air too thick, the silence too expectant, my own heartbeat too loud in my ears. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a decision I could never take back. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me with that same steady gaze, the one that had unraveled me piece by piece for weeks, the one that made me forget who I was, what I had to lose. My hands trembled as I set my purse down, my breath coming too fast, but I didn't leave. I should have. I could have. But I didn't. He poured a drink, slid it across the counter, the scrape of glass against wood the only sound in the room. I reached for it without thinking, my fingers brushing his, a spark, a current, a weight pressing down on my chest that I had no willpower to fight anymore. I took a sip, but the burn in my throat was nothing compared to the fire under my skin. He leaned back against the counter, his smirk barely there, waiting, knowing, as if he could already hear the excuses I would try to tell myself later. This was a mistake. This was inevitable. The minutes passed in slow motion, each one thick with something unspoken, something alive. We talked, or at least I think we did, words slipping between us like smoke, dissolving before they could take shape. I wasn't really listening. I was too focused on the way he moved, the way he watched me, the way every inch between us felt like a challenge. I told myself I would leave soon, that this was just a conversation, that I was in control. But I wasn't. Not when he took a step closer. Not when his hand grazed the inside of my wrist, his fingertips barely there but leaving a trail of fire in their wake. Not when I tilted my head up to meet his gaze, and for the first time I didn't look away. And then the silence changed. A shift in the air. A presence behind me. I turned, pulse slamming into my throat and my entire body locked in place. He was standing in the doorway. My husband. The room shrank, the walls closing in, the sound of my own breathing deafening in my ears. He didn't move. He didn't blink. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone, but his eyes, they were cold, hollow, sharper than I'd ever seen them. A look that stripped me bare, that burned away every lie I had told myself, every excuse I had clung to, every illusion that I could somehow keep this hidden. His voice when it came was calm, too controlled, and it sent ice through my veins. "So this is how it is." I opened my mouth, but no words came. There was nothing I could say. Nothing that would change what he had seen. Nothing that could undo what had already been done. The house felt different the second I stepped inside, like the walls themselves knew what had happened, like they had absorbed the truth and were now rejecting me. The familiar scent of home, once comforting, felt foreign, out of place, like I had walked into someone else's life. My husband was already there, sitting in his usual chair in the living room, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on the armrests, his expression unreadable. He didn't look up when I entered. He didn't acknowledge me at all. The silence wrapped around my throat like a vice, tighter with every passing second, suffocating, inescapable. I wanted him to say something, anything, to yell, to accuse, to give me something tangible to hold on to, but he didn't. And that was worse. I set my purse down slowly, listening to the hollow sound of it hitting the table, waiting, bracing, but nothing came. The weight of his silence pressed against my skin, heavier than any words ever could be. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What was there to say? That it hadn't meant anything? That it was a mistake? That I had lost control, but it wasn't what he thought? But it was. It was exactly what he thought. I moved toward the stairs, my steps too loud against the hardwood, every creak of the floorboards echoing through the silence like a confession. He still didn't look at me, still didn't move, and the air in the house felt too thick, too suffocating, like I was walking through water, like I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. Maybe I wasn't. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror, at the woman who no longer belonged in the life she had built. My hands rested on my lap, fingers twisting together, nails digging into my skin just to feel something real, something sharp enough to anchor me. I had known this moment was coming from the second I turned and saw him in that doorway, from the second our eyes met, and I understood, without a single word being spoken, that everything was over. The door downstairs opened, then closed. His footsteps, slow and deliberate, moved through the house. Not toward me. Never toward me. He wasn't coming up here. He wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't looking for anything. As I was already gone to him. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest, sharp and final, and I sucked in a breath, my vision blurring for a moment before I forced myself to steady. I wiped my hands over my face, exhaled slowly, but nothing cleared the weight sitting on my chest. And then I heard another set of footsteps. I turned my head slightly, my gaze falling to the open doorway, to the figure standing there. He didn't smirk this time. Didn't have that confident, teasing glint in his eyes. There was no challenge, no amusement, no trace of the game we had been playing. He just stood there, his posture stiff, his expression carefully blank, but his eyes, they were different now. There was no victory in them. No satisfaction. Just realization. Just regret. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, the silence between us stretched too thin, fragile like glass about to shatter. And in that moment I knew, whatever this had been, whatever we had told ourselves it had already crumbled. It was over. Not because we had been caught. Not because there was nothing left to say. But because we had nothing left to hold on to. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. It wasn't the comfortable stillness of early mornings, wasn't the peaceful hum of life going on behind closed doors. This was different. This was absence. This was an echo of something that had been broken beyond repair. My husband didn't yell, didn't demand explanations, didn't lash out in anger. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. It was a slow, deliberate kind of destruction, one that stretched over days, filling every corner of the house, settling into the walls, making itself at home in the space between us. He didn't leave immediately. That would have been easier. Instead, he moved through the house like a ghost, packing his things with a kind of patience that made my chest ache. He gave me time to sit with it, to feel the weight of what I had done, to let the reality of it sink in. I watched him from the doorway, my hands curled into fists at my sides, my throat too tight, my breath too shallow. I wanted to speak, to say something, but every word felt pointless, too small, too late. What could I possibly say? That I was sorry? That I hadn't meant for this to happen? That I hadn't known how far I had fallen until it was too late? But he already knew all of that. And none of it mattered. He zipped up his suitcase, straightened, turned to face me. His expression was unreadable, his gaze heavy but distant, like he was already gone even though he was still standing right in front of me. My chest tightened as he exhaled slowly, shaking his head just once, barely a movement at all, before he picked up his bag and walked past me without a word. The front door opened, closed, and just like that he was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. For a long time I just stood there, staring at the empty space where he had been, my ears straining for something. Footsteps coming back, a car engine roaring to life, anything. But there was nothing. Just stillness. Just the crushing weight of a choice I could never undo. I forced myself to move, to breathe, to exist in the emptiness I had created. The house felt unfamiliar now, the same walls, the same furniture, the same life I had always known, but stripped of warmth, of presence, of meaning. I walked through the rooms like a stranger, touching things that should have felt familiar, but nothing felt like mine anymore. And then I realized he was gone too. No note. No message. No lingering trace of him anywhere. It was like he had never been here at all, like the weeks, the months, the moments that had unraveled everything had simply dissolved into nothing. I stood in the hallway, staring at the door he used to walk through, waiting for a flicker of something, regret, longing, anger, but all I felt was emptiness. I moved through the house on autopilot, picking up objects just to put them back down, opening drawers just to close them again. Everything was still in its place, but the weight of what was missing was suffocating. My hands shook as I ran them over the kitchen counter, over the spot where he had once stood, smirking, daring me to admit what I already knew. I clenched my jaw, exhaled through my nose, willed the feeling away, but it stayed. It lived in the spaces between things, in the quiet that wasn't peaceful, in the way my chest felt too tight and too hollow all at once. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? Freedom. Something that had made my blood race, something that had made me feel alive again. But standing there in the wreckage of it all, I wasn't sure if I had been running toward something or if I had just been running away. The truth settled in my bones like lead. There was no going back. No fixing this. No pretending I could rebuild what had already turned to dust. My world had changed, but the most terrifying part of all was that I wasn't sure if I even wanted it to go back to the way it was. And that was the real price of my mistakes. Not the loss. Not the regret. But the fact that I didn't know if I would have done anything differently.